You know, the thing about being fired is this. You don't always leave broken. Sometimes you leave with the blueprints. I gave him 13 months. 13 months of rebuilding everything he'd let rot. The alliances, the finances, the trust his own people had stopped believing in. I sat in rooms where men twice my age deferred to him like he was something holy, and I was the only one in those rooms willing to tell him the truth. He hired me because he needed someone who wouldn't flinch. And for a while, for a long, strange while, I thought that mattered.
It didn't.
You forget who you work for. That's what he said. One sentence. Spoken the way someone swats at something small and irritating. And 13 months of my life folded into nothing just like that. Just like I was nothing. If you've ever poured everything you had into someone who looked right through it, if you've ever been told you were replaceable by the exact person who couldn't function without you, stay with me. Because this isn't a story about heartbreak. This is a story about what happens when the thing you threw away grows teeth. The office in Fargo smelled like old wood and newer money, the kind of wealth that hadn't yet learned to disguise itself. I'd been told to expect someone imposing. What I got was a man sitting behind a desk too large for the room, sleeves rolled, a glass of something dark and untouched beside a laptop he clearly didn't know how to use. Bruce didn't stand when I walked in, didn't offer his hand. He just watched me cross the room the way a man watches something he's already decided about. Quick assessment, file it away, move on. I didn't let him. I set my portfolio on his desk without asking permission, opened it, and pointed to the first page. A summary.
Clean.
Brutal. Every broken system in his financial network laid out in plain language, because I'd spent 2 weeks before this meeting learning exactly how badly things had deteriorated. His lieutenants had been skimming for years. His territorial agreements were built on handshakes, not documentation. 2 of his largest revenue streams were hemorrhaging money that no one had bothered to track. This is what you're working with, I said. Not a greeting. Not small talk. I can fix it, but I need full access, and I need you to stay out of my way while I do. The silence that followed was the kind that tells you everything. Bruce's jaw tightened. Barely, just enough. His eyes moved from the portfolio to me, and something shifted in them. Not respect. Not yet. Something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Or the faint, unsettling recognition of encountering something you don't have a word for. Everyone who sat in that chair, he said slowly, has told me what they need from me. I'm not asking for anything from you, I said. I'm telling you what your operation requires. Another beat of silence. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Then Bruce leaned back. Not relaxing, recalculating. I'd seen that posture before, in boardrooms and war rooms and every space where men decided whether someone was useful or disposable. I knew what it meant. He was deciding which one I was. You're not here to impress me, he said. It wasn't a question.
No.
Most people are. Most people are afraid of you. I said, and I meant it plainly, the way you state the weather. I'm not. I'm here because your empire is failing, and I'm the best person alive to stop it. If that's enough for you, we start Monday. If it isn't, I walk out that door, and you find someone else willing to lie to you about how bad it is. I watched his face. Not for approval. I'd learned long ago that approval was a currency I couldn't afford to need. I watched for the thing that mattered. Whether he was the kind of man who could hear the truth and survive it. Bruce held my gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone, dialed a number, and told someone on the other end to set up my access credentials. He never said yes. He never said thank you. He simply made the call, the way a man does when he's realized, quietly and without wanting to, that someone in the room is smarter than he is. That was the first thing I should have understood about Bruce. Not that he was dangerous, not that he was old, not that the world bent around him like light bends around something heavy. What I should have understood is this. He had spent 300 years surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear. And I was the first person who hadn't. That wasn't power. That was a countdown. I just didn't know it yet. The first lieutenant I cut was a man named Gorski. He'd been skimming from Bruce's Eastern Territory accounts for 11 years. Not boldly, not stupidly, but with the quiet patience of someone who understood that small, consistent theft is harder to detect than theft that announces itself. He moved money in increments so small they looked like rounding errors. Administrative fees that didn't correspond to any service. Consulting payments to companies that existed only on paper. It was almost elegant, the way he'd built it. Almost enough to make me admire the architecture before I tore it down. I brought the file to Bruce on a Tuesday night. Not because Tuesday held any significance, but because I'd spent 6 days cross-referencing the numbers, and by Tuesday I was certain. Certainty mattered to me more than timing ever did. Bruce read the file, without expression. That was the thing about him, his face gave away almost nothing when he was processing something that mattered. It was the small things that betrayed him. The way his thumb pressed against the edge of the desk. The slight stillness in his breathing. I'd begun cataloging these tells the way I cataloged financial discrepancies, not out of affection but out of necessity. To do my job, I needed to understand the man whose empire I was rebuilding. And understanding Bruce meant learning to read the spaces between what he showed and what he actually felt. Gorski, he said, finally setting the file down. Not a question. 11 years, I said. Approximately 4.3 million, when you account for compounding. Bruce was quiet for a long time after that. The kind of quiet that isn't emptiness, it's weight. It's a man who has spent centuries trusting no one and just discovered that the people he trusted least were, in fact, the people he should have trusted least. I didn't fill the silence. I'd learned early in my career that silence after bad news is not something you fix with words. It's something you let a person sit inside until they're ready to move through it on their own. Handle it, Bruce said. And I did. Gorski was removed within 48 hours. Quietly. No confrontation, no dramatic reveal before the court. I simply informed him that his access had been revoked and that the discrepancies in his accounts had been documented. He left the way people leave when they know the alternative is something worse than leaving, without argument, without dignity, without looking back. That was the first. There were others. Over the months that followed, I moved through Bruce's network like water finding cracks in stone, slowly, inevitably, without force. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't build alliances or rally supporters or make myself visible in the way that people who want to be noticed make themselves visible. I simply worked. And the work spoke for itself in ways that no speech ever could. The second lieutenant I removed was a woman named Petra Voss, older than Gorski, sharper, more dangerous. She hadn't been stealing money. She'd been stealing influence. Quietly redirecting loyalty, positioning herself as the real decision-maker behind Bruce's territorial agreements while Bruce believed he was in control. It was a more sophisticated kind of theft than Gorski's. It required patience, intelligence, and a deep understanding of how power actually moves inside organizations built on fear. I recognized it because I understood it. Not because I'd done it myself, but because I knew what it looked like when someone decided that the person above them didn't deserve to be above them. I knew that feeling. I'd carried it myself in other rooms, in other lives, before I'd learned to channel it into something more useful than resentment. Petra was harder to remove than Gorski. She fought back, not openly, but through the same quiet channels she'd spent years building. She tried to turn two of Bruce's younger lieutenants against me, painting me as an outsider who didn't understand how things worked. And, in a way, she was right. I didn't understand how things worked. I understood how things should work. And the gap between those two realities was exactly where my value lived. Bruce watched all of it unfold. He never intervened, never questioned my methods or my timeline. He simply observed, with that particular stillness I'd come to recognize as his version of attention. Not the kind of attention that says I'm impressed. The kind that says I'm watching something I don't fully understand, and I'm not sure yet whether it's going to help me or destroy me. By month 7, the territory's wealth had increased by 60%. By month 10, it had nearly tripled. The alliances I restructured weren't just financially sound, they were architecturally sound. I built systems that didn't depend on any single person's loyalty or fear. I built systems that worked because they were designed to work, not because someone was watching. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, somewhere between the files and the quiet removals and the long nights spent mapping Bruce's world from the inside out, I began to understand something about the man I was working for that I hadn't expected to feel. Not love. Not even closeness, not really. Something lonelier than either. I began to understand that Bruce had spent 3 centuries surrounded by people who needed him, and not one of them had ever simply sat across from him and told him the truth about what he was looking at. Until I did. And the terrible, quiet thing about that, the thing that sat in my chest like something I couldn't name, is that for a while, I thought it made me safe. I thought being necessary was the same as being valued.
I was wrong about that.
But I wouldn't find out how wrong until much, much later. The council meeting was held on a Thursday in February, in a room on the top floor of Bruce's Fargo estate where the windows faced north and the light never quite reached the center of the table. I'd been in that room dozens of times by then, running reports, presenting restructured alliance proposals, sitting in the back while Bruce's lieutenants argued over territory boundaries that I'd already redrawn on paper. I knew the room the way I knew every other part of Bruce's world by then, intimately, functionally, without sentiment. I wasn't supposed to speak that night. I was there to observe. Bruce had called a session to finalize a trade agreement with a coalition in western Montana, a deal that would consolidate 3 smaller territories under his network and bring in significant revenue over the following year. It was, on paper, a sound decision. Bruce had spent weeks negotiating the terms himself, which was unusual. Normally, he delegated that kind of work to me now. But this particular deal had personal history attached to it, old rivalries, older grudges, and Bruce wanted to be the one to close it. I understood that. I respected it even. There are things men like Bruce need to do themselves, not because they're better at it, but because the act of doing it is part of what holds them together. I'd learned to recognize those moments and stay quiet through them. But the numbers were wrong. I saw it halfway through the session. Bruce was presenting the final terms, the revenue projections, the territorial concessions, the timeline for integration, and the figures he quoted didn't align with what I'd built into the system. Not by a small margin, by enough that anyone paying close attention would notice. And no one in that room was paying close attention because no one in that room had spent the last 11 months learning Bruce's finances the way I had. They were nodding, agreeing, deferring to him the way they always deferred, not because the numbers made sense, but because questioning Bruce publicly was something none of them had ever survived doing. I sat there for exactly 45 seconds, turning it over in my mind. 45 seconds of weighing what I knew against what it would cost to say it out loud. I thought about staying quiet, thought about pulling Bruce aside afterward, showing him the discrepancy in private, letting him correct it without anyone knowing he'd gotten it wrong. That would have been the safer choice. The quieter one. The one that kept everything the way it had been for the past year. Me working in the background, Bruce in front, the arrangement functioning the way it was designed to function. But 45 seconds is a long time to sit with something you know is wrong. Those projections don't hold. The room went still the way a room goes still, when someone says something no one expected to hear. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear. A fact, stated plainly, the way I'd stated every fact I'd ever brought to Bruce, without apology, without softness, without the careful cushioning that people in that room had spent centuries wrapping around every piece of bad news they'd ever delivered to him. Every face turned to me. Bruce's expression didn't change, not visibly, but I felt the shift. Felt it the way you feel a temperature drop in a room when someone opens a window you didn't know was there. Something moved behind his eyes. Something I hadn't seen before. I stood. Not dramatically. Not to make a point about authority or presence. I stood because what I was about to say required me to be on my feet, and because sitting down while correcting a man like Bruce in front of his court would have looked like deference I didn't feel. The Montana Coalition's revenue capacity is based on their current extraction rates, I said, keeping my voice level, factual, the way you'd read aloud from a document. Those rates have been declining for 2 years. The projections Bruce is quoting assume a baseline that hasn't existed since last spring. The actual return on this agreement at current capacity is roughly 40% less than what's on the table tonight. I didn't look at Bruce when I said it. I looked at the numbers on the screen behind him, the ones I'd spent the last 3 days verifying, cross-referencing, checking again. I looked at them because they were the truth, and the truth didn't need my eye contact to be true. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had come before. Before, it had been surprise. Now it was something heavier. Something that had weight and edges and consequence. I turned to Bruce then. Not confrontationally. Not with triumph or satisfaction. I turned to him the way you turn to someone after you've just handed them something difficult. Openly. Waiting for them to decide what to do with it. His face was perfectly still. That was how I knew I'd broken something. Not the deal. Not the room. Something quieter than that. Something that lived in the space between how Bruce saw himself in that room and how I had just, in 45 seconds, made everyone else see him differently. I didn't enjoy it. That's the thing people assume, that correcting someone powerful feels like power. It doesn't. It feels like standing at the edge of something you can't take back, knowing exactly what it's going to cost, and choosing to say it anyway because the alternative, silence, would have cost more. Not to Bruce.
To me.
To the 13 months I'd spent rebuilding something I believed in. Bruce nodded.
Once.
Slowly. The way a man nods when he's already decided something, and the decision has nothing to do with the numbers on the screen. We'll revisit the terms, he said.
Flat.
Final. And then the meeting ended, the way meetings end when the person running them decides there's nothing left to say. I walked out of that room carrying something I couldn't quite name yet. Not guilt. Not satisfaction. Something closer to the quiet, cold awareness that I had just handed Bruce a reason to see me differently, and that the woman I'd been when I walked in would never be the woman I was when I walked out. I just didn't know yet what that difference was going to cost me. He called me into his study 3 days after the council meeting. Not the office where we usually worked, the study. A smaller room on the second floor of the estate, lined with books Bruce had never read and furnished with leather that had gone soft with age. It was the kind of room that belonged to a man performing the idea of authority rather than actually exercising it. I noticed that about Bruce sometimes, the way he'd surround himself with symbols of power in spaces where real power had already left the room. I sat across from him. The desk between us was smaller than the one in his main office. Closer. I noticed that too, though I didn't let myself think about what it meant. He didn't speak right away. Just sat there, watching me the way he'd watched me in that council room, with that particular stillness that I'd spent months learning to read. But this time the stillness felt different. Heavier. Like something had already been decided, and the conversation was just a formality. I waited. I'd learned long ago that the person who fills silence first is the person who needs the other to speak.
I didn't need Bruce to speak.
I needed him to say whatever he was going to say so I could hear it and deal with it the way I dealt with everything, clearly, without pretense, and without giving him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "You embarrass me," he said finally. Not angry. That was the thing that made it land the way it did. If he'd been angry, I could have met it, could have stood in it, defended myself, made my case the way I made every case, with precision and evidence and the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're right. Anger is something you can work with. Anger has edges you can grab onto. But Bruce wasn't angry. He was quiet. And his quiet was the kind that doesn't leave room for argument, because it's already finished the argument inside itself before the other person even opens their mouth. "I corrected an error," I said. Not defensively. Just stating what had happened, the way I'd state anything, plainly, without decoration. In front of my court, yes. In front of everyone who has spent 3 centuries understanding that no one corrects me. Not publicly. Not in a room where it can be seen. I looked at him then, really looked, the way I hadn't let myself look at Bruce in a long time. Not at the man behind the desk. At the thing underneath him. The fear. The ancient, calcified fear of a man who had built everything he had on the belief that control was the only thing standing between him and irrelevance. And I had, in 45 seconds, cracked that belief open in front of the people whose respect was the foundation it sat on. I understood it. I did. I understood what it cost him. And for a moment, just a moment, something in my chest tightened with something that might have been compassion, or might have been grief, or might have been the quiet recognition that I was watching a man I had spent 13 months caring about reveal, finally, exactly what he was. "You're right," I said. "I should have brought it to you privately." Bruce looked at me for a long time after that. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of weight, pressing down on both of us, on the space between us, on everything I'd built in this room and every other room in his world over the past year. Then he said it. "You forget who you work for." For words. Spoken without volume, without emphasis, without the theatrical weight that men like Bruce sometimes attach to sentences they want you to remember. He said it the way someone states something that has already happened. Something past tense. Something that can't be undone. And I understood, in the space between one breath and the next, that this wasn't a warning. It wasn't an opportunity to explain myself or apologize or promise it wouldn't happen again. It was an ending, delivered so cleanly, so precisely, that it almost felt like something I had done to myself. "You're letting me go," I said. Bruce didn't nod. Didn't say yes. Didn't say anything at all. He just held my gaze with that ancient stillness, and the absence of denial was the only confirmation I needed. I sat there for a moment. Not processing. I'd already processed it. Not grieving. Grief would come later if it came at all, and I wasn't the kind of woman who let it come in front of the person who caused it. I sat there because I was giving myself 10 seconds to feel whatever I was going to feel before I stood up and walked out of this room, and out of this life I'd spent 13 months building. 10 seconds. That's all I allowed myself. Then I stood. Picked up my laptop from the edge of his desk. The same laptop I'd carried in on my first day. The same one that held 13 months of his secrets, his finances, the architecture of everything he owned.
I didn't look at him again.
Didn't ask for an explanation or a reason or anything beyond what he'd already given me, which was the truth. The truth was this. I had made myself indispensable, and he had fired me anyway. Because indispensable, to a man like Bruce, wasn't safety. It was threat. I walked out of the study,
Down the hallway,
through the front door of the estate, and into the parking lot where the February air hit my face like a slap, sharp and clarifying. I stood there for a long time, not crying, not shaking, Not falling apart the way people expect you to fall apart when the ground disappears beneath you. I stood there thinking, because somewhere inside the wreckage of 13 months, underneath the quiet devastation of being discarded by a man I had given almost everything I had, underneath all of it, something was already moving. Something cold and precise and patient, the way I was patient, the way I had always been patient when the work required it. I didn't know yet what it was going to become, but I knew it was going to be enough. The drive from North Dakota to South Dakota takes less than an hour if you don't stop. I stopped once. A gas station somewhere along I-29, fluorescent light bleeding into the dark, the kind of place that exists only as a pause between one place and another. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after filling the tank, not moving, not thinking about Bruce, not thinking about anything at all. Just breathing. Letting the silence of the car settle around me like something solid. Like armor I was putting back on, piece by piece, after someone had spent 13 months convincing me I didn't need it. Silas found me before I found him. That was important, the order of it. Because it meant he'd been watching, waiting. The way old power waits, without urgency, without desperation, with the kind of patience that only centuries can teach a man. He contacted me through a channel I won't name, using a method I won't describe, and the message was exactly 4 sentences long. The first 3 were operational, a location, a time, a single question about my availability. The 4th sentence was the one that mattered. I know what he did to you, and I know what you built for him. I read that sentence 3 times. Not because it was complicated, because it was accurate. And accuracy, coming from someone I'd never met, meant that Silas had been paying closer attention to Bruce's empire than Bruce had ever realized. Which meant Bruce's vulnerabilities were already known. Which meant the work I'd done, the systems I'd built, the architecture I'd designed, had already been studied by someone who understood exactly how to use it as a weapon. I drove to Sioux Falls on a Wednesday. The office Silas had arranged was unremarkable, a 3rd-floor suite in a building that housed a dozen other businesses no one had ever heard of. Clean lines. Minimal furniture. A desk with nothing on it except a laptop and a single manila folder, and inside that folder was a map of Bruce's territory that I recognized immediately because I was the one who'd drawn it. Silas himself was not what I expected. He was older than Bruce, not in appearance, but in the way he occupied space. Where Bruce filled a room with the pressure of his presence, Silas emptied one. He sat in a corner like he was trying to take up as little of it as possible, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume to be heard. He didn't introduce himself with power. He introduced himself with a question. Why did you leave? I looked at him for a long moment, not deciding whether to trust him. Trust wasn't relevant here. This wasn't about trust. This was about whether I was willing to do what came next, and whether Silas was the right person to do it with. He fired me, I said. I know. Why did you leave? The distinction mattered, and we both knew it. Being fired and choosing to go are not the same thing. Bruce had ended my position. I had ended my willingness to be in it. The firing was the event. My departure was the decision. And Silas was asking about the decision because the decision was where my value lived. Because staying would have meant pretending it didn't happen, I said. And I don't pretend. Silas nodded. Slowly. The way someone nods when an answer confirms something they already believed. The first move I made against Bruce was not dramatic. It wasn't meant to be. It was a single phone call to a lieutenant in Bruce's Western Territory, a man named Loring, someone I'd interviewed during the restructuring and whose loyalty to Bruce I had always suspected was thinner than it appeared. I didn't threaten him, didn't offer him money or power or protection. I simply told him what Bruce had done to me, and I let him draw his own conclusions about what kind of man he was working for. Loring defected within a week. The second move was quieter still. I redirected a financial pipeline that Bruce's Eastern Territories depended on, one I had personally designed, one that I knew ran through exactly 3 access points, all of which I still had the knowledge to manipulate. The money didn't disappear. It simply stopped flowing in the direction it had been flowing and started flowing somewhere else. Somewhere that benefited Silas's network. Somewhere that hurt Bruce in ways he wouldn't feel immediately, but would feel eventually, the way you feel a slow leak in a foundation. Not all at once, but enough to make the whole structure question itself. By the end of the first month, 2 of Bruce's territorial agreements had fallen apart. Not because anyone had challenged him directly. Because the systems that held them together, the systems I had built, were no longer being maintained by someone who wanted them to work. I want you to understand something about what this felt like. It did not feel like revenge. Revenge is hot. Revenge is loud. Revenge needs an audience to feel real. What I was doing was none of those things. What I was doing was cold.
Precise.
Methodical. It felt like work, the same kind of work I'd done for Bruce, turned inside out and aimed in the opposite direction. The same skills, the same patience, the same quiet, ruthless competence that had made me indispensable to him, now making me the most dangerous thing in his world. And the worst part, the part that sat in my chest at night like something I couldn't swallow, was that every weapon I used against him was something he had given me.
Not willingly.
Not knowingly. But he had handed me 13 months of access, 13 months of trust, 13 months of learning the deepest architecture of his power. And when he decided I was no longer worth keeping, he forgot that everything he'd taught me came with me when I walked out that door. That's what Bruce never understood about women like me. We don't leave empty-handed. We leave with everything we were ever given. And we know exactly what to do with it. Bruce chose the hotel. A place in Sioux Falls called the Aldridge. Old brick, dark hallways, the kind of establishment that doesn't advertise because the people who need it already know it's there. He'd called through Silas's network, which meant he already knew where I was operating. Which meant he'd been watching. Which meant the man who had fired me in 4 words had spent the months since trying to find me the way a man searches for something he didn't know he needed until it was gone. I agreed to the meeting without hesitation. Not because I wanted to see him. Not because some part of me was hoping for something, closure, confrontation, the satisfaction of watching him realize what he'd lost. I agreed because the meeting was the last move. The final step in a sequence I'd been building since the night I stood in that parking lot in February, breathing cold air and feeling something take shape inside me that I hadn't yet given a name. Now it had one. The room was on the 4th floor. A standard suite, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. Bruce had chosen it, and the choice told me something. He wasn't performing tonight. He wasn't trying to remind me of what he was or what he could offer. He was just a man in a hotel room, waiting for a woman he had discarded to tell him what it had cost. He was already seated when I walked in, at a small round table by the window, hands wrapped around a glass of something dark that he wasn't drinking. The lamp beside him cast a low amber light across half his face, and the other half sat in shadow, and for a moment I just stood in the doorway and looked at him the way you look at someone you once built a world for, with a particular grief of knowing exactly how it ended. He looked tired. Not physically. Bruce would never look physically tired, not in the way humans do. But something behind his eyes had worn down. Something that had once been sharp and certain and untouchable had dulled, the way a blade dulls when it's been used against something harder than itself.
Nadia.
My name in his mouth sounded different than it used to. Quieter. Like something he was holding carefully, afraid of dropping. I sat across from him. Didn't remove my coat. Didn't set down my laptop bag. I sat the way someone sits when they're not planning to stay long. Present, but not settling in. Bruce noticed. Of course he noticed. He'd always noticed the small things about me. It was the large things he'd failed to see.
He spoke first.
Not immediately. There was a silence between us that needed to exist before anything else could, and we both let it sit there, heavy and honest, the way two people sit with something that can't be unsaid. "I want you to come back," he said. The words landed without surprise. I'd known they were coming, had been preparing for them, in a way, since the moment I agreed to this meeting. But knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are different things, and for a moment, just a moment, something in my chest tightened with the ghost of what those words might have meant to me once. In another life. Before the parking lot. Before South Dakota. Before I understood that wanting to come back and deserving to come back are not the same thing. "I'll give you everything," Bruce continued, and his voice carried something I had never heard in it before, something raw, something stripped of the careful control he'd maintained for 3 centuries. "Full authority. Whatever title you want. I'll introduce you to the court as my equal. I'll acknowledge what you built. He stopped. Swallowed. The gesture was so human, it almost broke something in me. Almost. "I'll apologize.
Publicly. For all of it."
I let him finish. Let the silence after his words sit in the room the way it needed to. And then I looked at him. Not with anger. Not with coldness. Not with the sharp precision I'd carried through 13 months of rebuilding his empire and 6 months of dismantling it. I looked at him with something quieter than any of those things. Something that might have been sadness. "You taught me something, Bruce," I said. My voice was steady.
Calm.
The same voice I'd used in that council meeting, the same voice I'd used the day he fired me, factual, unhurried, carrying no more emotion than the truth required. "The day you let me go, you taught me something I hadn't understood before. You taught me that loyalty without respect is just labor. That a woman can give a man everything she has, her mind, her time, the best years of her ability, and if he doesn't see her, if he truly doesn't see her, then none of it was ever about her. It was about what she could do for him." Bruce's jaw tightened, the way it always did when something landed. "I gave you 13 months of my life," I said. "And you treated it like it meant nothing." 1 sentence, Bruce. That's all it took for you to erase everything I'd built. Everything I'd given you.
"I know," he said.
Barely a whisper. "God, Nadia. I know. Then you know why I can't come back." Something shifted in his face then. Something final. The last wall crumbling. The last piece of hope he'd been carrying into this room. The belief that if he offered enough, said the right words, showed enough of the man underneath the 3 centuries of armor, she would forgive him. That she would choose him again. I watched it fall. Watched the light leave his eyes the way light leaves a room when someone closes the curtains, slowly, then all at once. "Now watch," I said, and I stood. Picked up my laptop bag from beside my chair. Slipped my hand into my coat pocket and pressed the button I'd been carrying since I sat down. Outside the window, on the rooftop across the street, a man named Colton, someone Silas had trusted with this task for reasons I didn't need to know, adjusted his scope. Bruce looked at me.
Just looked.
And in that look was everything he'd never said when it could have changed something. Every word he'd swallowed in 13 months of watching me work. Every moment he'd felt something he didn't have a name for. Every regret that had found him too late to matter. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are," I said. The bullet was silver. It entered cleanly, precisely, the way all endings should, without drama, without excess, without giving the person on the receiving end time to argue. Bruce didn't fall.
Didn't gasp.
Didn't reach for me, or say my name again, or do any of the things that stories tell you dying men do. He simply sat there, very still, his eyes on mine, and in the last seconds he had, I watched something move across his face that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not fear. Not anger. Understanding. He finally saw me. Not what I could do for him. Not what I was worth to his empire.
Me.
The woman. The mind. The person he had held at arm's length for 13 months and then discarded in 4 words. He saw her. And it was too late. I walked to the door. Opened it. The hallway light spilled in, bright, ordinary, indifferent to what had just happened in this room. I didn't look back. I carried my laptop out into the morning. The same thing I'd left with. The same thing I'd always carried. Not because it held his secrets, but because it held mine. My work. My precision. My quiet, ruthless ability to build and destroy with equal care. Outside, the air was cold and the sky was turning pale at the edges, and I walked through it unhurried, the way someone walks when they've finally set down something they've been carrying for a very long time.
There are others like me.
Women who were handed everything by men who didn't understand what they were giving away. We don't announce ourselves. We don't ask to be remembered. But the empires we leave behind tell you everything you need to know.